So I have just three opening comments I want to make. First, I am awfully pleased to be here as well, not only because of the high regard the Casey Foundation has for child trends, but my own personal regard for Chris and all the work that she did during her leadership of Child Trends, and for Carol. So thanks so much for inviting me. Second thing, as Mindy said that she was not speaking on behalf of the Congressional Research Service, I don't pretend to speak for everyone at the Casey Foundation. I do expect everybody from the Casey Foundation who is here to be taking very careful notes. But other than that, this should be seen as my own thinking. And finally, when I looked at the participant list, the folks who were coming to this meeting, I remembered the story about this guy who had managed to survive the huge Williamsport flood. He was one of the few people who survived, and forever after, he told the story again and again and again about how he survived. And as he got older, he more and more enjoyed telling the story, to the point where his whole life revolved around this particular event in his life and his ability to regale people about this story. And when he finally passed away, he was given his reward. He went to heaven, and St. Peter said, people don't realize this, but you get to have one choice about the one thing in heaven you really would like to have as part of your experience. And he said, if I could only be able to tell this story. And St. Peter said, easily arranged. Tomorrow show up, tell the story. The guy prepares, he goes the next day, he's about to step up to the podium just like this. St. Peter stands up and he says, are you ready? He says, I'm so ready. Thank you for allowing me to do this. That's great. Oh, and by the way, Noah's in the audience. So as I think about speaking to you all, I will share my own particular thoughts on this question of how do we invest in children in a wiser kind of a way, recognizing that any one of you could perhaps be up here and add lots of those ideas as well. So three things I'm going to talk about. Number one, what principles should we apply as we make some of these tough decisions, especially in regards to children going forward? Second, what are the highest payoff areas we ought to be investing in from my point of view? And finally, what do we know about how to scale up what works? So those are the three things I'm going to talk about. I'll start with this question of principles, and I've got four basic principles. I believe strongly that as we think about the future, as we think about how to invest and how to get ahead of our budget situation, we've got to constantly keep in mind a long-term frame. And the question we ought to be asking ourselves, number one, is what kind of America do we want 20 to 50 years from now? We've got to ask ourselves that question. What do we need in America 20 to 50 years from now to compete? What are the biggest threats to our prosperity? What are the biggest threats to our freedoms? What are the biggest threats to our vibrancy? What are the biggest threats to our social cohesion, that which holds us together? And I would argue very strongly that the biggest threats all come around the question of whether or not where you get to in life continues to depend on where you start. Because to the extent that this is a country that works, it's a country that works because we believe collectively in opportunity, what the sociologists would call social mobility, that you can move in this country. And to the extent that we lose that because of poor budgetary decisions, then I strongly believe we will start to tear away at the fabric of this country. So first question is, what kind of America do we want our children to live in and our grandchildren to live in? Second, as a principle, I think we need to pay attention to what I think of as multiplier effects. And what I mean by that is we ought to invest in those children's programs that have multiple impacts. For example, we know that you can predict lots of rotten outcomes just by knowing if a child grows up in poverty. Improving the financial situation of families so that children are not growing up in poverty, in fact, has multiple positive impacts, including impacts on our revenues, by the way. So it's not a bad investment. Similarly, we know, all the research tells us, that a child who is not reading well by the end of third grade, by fourth grade, a child who's not reading well is on a path away from opportunity and away from success. So we ought to think about investments that guarantee that every child is reading proficiently by the end of third grade. Why? Because it has a multiplier effect. Lots of other things depend on that. We know that post-secondary education in the future as well as in the present, but increasingly post-secondary education, post-secondary training and a credential is critical for our workforce. It has a multiplier effect. And we know that strong families and being connected to a strong family for life, a family you can count on, has a multiplier effect. So that's a principle we ought to be looking at. So therefore, we ought to be choosing investments that make other investments more effective. Investing heavily in early childhood makes later investments in education more effective. We ought to invest more in early childhood. Investing in parental mental health, for example, just as one example, maternal depression. Investing in helping folks suffering from maternal depression deal with those kinds of problems in a way that does not impact on the children, hugely important. Post-traumatic stress, hugely important. And we ought to avoid cuts that, in fact, multiply the negative impacts. So as we think about what may have to be cut, and we will have to make some tough choices, let's not cut things that we know are going to have long-term bad impacts if we cut them. Cutting from prevention and early intervention is not going to help us in the long run, either financially or socially or where we want to be as a country. So that's the second principle, pay attention to multiplier effects. The third principle, we need to shift programs, shift funding from programs that harm children to programs that help children. Now, you may be sitting here, and there's often this debate, well, I'm a little bit nervous about all this evidence-based practice stuff because, as others have pointed out, we may be holding programs to a higher standard for kids and we're holding for other folks. I'm not talking about those close calls. We now spend, both in the federal and the state budget, billions of dollars on programs that ultimately, based on research, harm children. Incarceration that is not necessary harms kids. Incarceration of parents and incarceration of juveniles. The way that we incarcerate juveniles does not protect the community and does not help kids. It harms kids, and we spend lots of money on that. Not necessarily all congregate care or residential treatment, et cetera, is bad, but the way we use it in many, many states, hugely expensive, not particularly helpful, and in many instances harmful to children. We do need to invest less in those programs that have little evidence of success. Now, again, I'm not even talking about the close calls here, because I am a firm believer that we know a lot more than we used to, but we got a lot more to learn before we start saying, well, only things that meet the gold standard of randomized clinical trial, that's all we're going to fund. That's a mistake. However, there are lots of things that we're funding that we actually have multiple studies with very disappointing results, and we got to have the political and public will to say, you know what, we may be able to continue experimenting in that area, but we're not going to spend big bucks in that area. We're going to put more dollars in those things where we've got better evidence that it works. Final principle, choose investments that leverage. So choose investments that leverage federal and state money together. Choose investments that leverage philanthropy. Choose investments that leverage the private sector. Choose investments that leverage the faith sector and volunteers. So those are the principles that I would use if I was ever asked by Ways and Means about my ideas about where we go. So I want to now shift to the second thing I wanted to talk about, which is where I see the highest payoff kind of investments. And as I was thinking about how to put this, it occurred to me that if you think about children and development from an age standpoint, there are two periods of development that we ought to pay a whole lot of attention to, and they intersect. Right? So what's he talking about? All right. So there's the prenatal to age 8. Right? That's a critical developmental period. I talked before about reading proficiently by the end of third grade. That's just a marker. But if you can read proficiently by the end of third grade, probably lots of things in your life went well. The second age group I want to talk about are the 16 to 24 folks. Now, you might say, well, what happens to the 9 to 15-year-olds? I'm not saying they're not important. What I'm saying is, if you think about it developmentally, the 16 to 24 age group are often the parents of the most vulnerable, very young children. And these are both areas, 0 to 8 and 16 to 24, where we've got a lot of evidence about what works and a lot of opportunity to invest more than we are today in ways that will pay off. So, for example, and this will sound like a menu, but I'm going to come back to it. Teen pregnancy prevention. So when I say 0 to 8, I'm including delaying childbirth until one is ready to have kids. Prenatal investments, investments in nutrition, effective home visiting programs, all sorts of different kinds of parental coaching programs that engage the parents as the important teachers of their children. High-quality early childhood and preschool programs, big investments in early elementary years. These are all investments that the research tells us if you choose the right programs and, in fact, keep the fidelity and invest well, these will have high payoffs in terms of 0 to 8. In parallel to that, with the 0 to 8 population, we need to mitigate risk. We know that certain cities have taken on the challenge of lead poisoning, for example, in a very serious way, and in fact have essentially eliminated lead poisoning for their kids entering kindergarten. That's a huge accomplishment. So why isn't every single city on a path to eliminate lead poisoning? We know that mold can lead to asthma, which can lead to absenteeism, which impacts on kids. We are learning more and more and more than we ever knew about toxic stress and about adverse childhood experiences. These are all things that are risk factors that we know something about how to mitigate and, in fact, will have huge payoffs. Turning to the 16 to 24 age group, I saw on the list that Ron Haskins was going to be here. I don't actually see him here, but Ron Haskins and Belle Sawhill wrote this great book, and their theme in there was that if folks are able to attach to the workforce, complete their education, and form a strong family, the odds of their kids being poor and of them having experienced poverty go way, way down. This is very important information. So we know a lot about how to train folks. We know a lot about how to attach them to the workforce. We know increasingly how to attach folks to post-secondary education and to figure out multiple pathways to a successful transition. Now, again, this sounds like a menu, right? Let me ask you to think about one thing. You know, I have 4 kids, but one of the kids is a tutor. And she's one of these folks who tutors the super rich in New York and Connecticut, and she goes around and she has all sorts of stories. I'll tell you later. But one of the things that strikes me is that as she has been exposed to the super rich, guess what they invest in for their kids? Do they get prenatal care? You bet you think that's a good idea, right? Do they get high-quality early childhood experiences? Are they doggone sure that their kid is signed up for the absolute best preschool program he or she could possibly get? And on and on and on and on and on. So we got lots of research that says this work, but what do we ourselves invest in? What do the richest of us invest in? And in some cases, again, these are some of the stories, overinvest in. We invest in the success of our very young children because we know it's important. So I would suggest to you that we take a lesson from ourselves. These are the highest payoffs investments that we can make. You also should have seen through this a very important point from my point of view, which is that this is a 2-generation strategy. And we're now starting to learn more and more from research that what makes a good parent also is the kind of skills and capacities that help people attach successfully to the workforce. And vice versa. You know, this term of executive functioning, which I don't like because I don't function so well as an executive, but this term, this idea that what it takes to be a successful adult in the workforce is also what you need to be a successful parent. You know, that means this simultaneous thinking about parenting and economic success, child success, and parent success. This is a simultaneous, both generations at the same time kind of strategy we ought to be investing in. Last thing I want to talk about is this issue of scaling what works. You know, I'm a strong believer that we have to keep plugging away at evidence-based programs. We've got to invest in research, et cetera. But at the same time, I also recognize, and a lot because the folks from the evidence-based practice group at the Casey Foundation, Abel and Eileen are here, but others have sort of taught me that it's in addition to a particular program, it's learning the core elements of those programs that, in fact, cut across lots of our interventions. Engaging families. You look at almost every successful evidence-based practice, and it really does well at engaging families. It's just like one example. So it's practices, evidence-based practices, and evidence-based programs. The scaling challenge really comes down to lots of different pieces. We are learning more and more about the financing side of this. You know, there's all this kind of experimentation going on right now. I think this is a really important time to experiment. The federal government's investing, some states are investing, ranging from social impact bonds to human capital performance bonds to paying for success, paying for outcomes, performance contracting. We've got a lot to learn, but let's keep on this path, because I really strongly believe that if we can do that, if we can add rigor to our financing strategies, we'll be in a much better strategy to much better position to make good decisions. I believe that in this scaling what works issue, there's a missing link as I've looked around the field. And the missing link is that we tend to go at it as if we're trying to do a franchise, right? We're trying to replicate a successful program. And let's say there's one successful program, and we say, well, let's do that again, and we get it up to 10, then we get to 100, then we get to 1,000. You get to 1,000, you say, we are scaling up. But if you ask the question of all the folks who could benefit from this particular intervention, what percentage of the folks are you reaching? And the answer comes back 3%. And if you look at those 1,000 programs, and the reality is maybe 200 of them are really working, the other 800 are a pale imitation of the first one, that's not scale. That's replication. That's franchising. It's an important piece of scale, but it's not scale. The missing link is you've got to figure out where this program fits in the larger systems that spend lots of money on kids. Now, there's a hazard here. People tend to go to the system level when they want to say, I want to scale up, so I want to capture the money that systems hold. And so they get a special line item, maybe in the federal government or in a state government, or they capture a little bit of money and they think, yeah, I use the system, I'm there. Guess what gets cut awful easy? The line item or that special appropriation. I am really talking about the fundamental investments that systems, child welfare systems, mental health systems, workforce systems, education systems, the fundamental way they do business is the secret to scale. And we've got to figure out a way to marry what we're learning about evidence-based practices and programs with what we know about systems in order to bring them together. The bumper sticker here is a bad system will trump a good program any day of the week. So I think that's the missing link. It's also a different way to think about the market for these programs. I would leave you with a sense that these large systems are like oak trees, and we keep planting daisies, right? And the shade from the, I don't know if this is true, I hope there's nobody who knows about daisies here, but we keep planting them in the shade of the oak trees and the daisies die, right? We got to really get to the oak trees. We got to figure out how do we start changing these systems in order to make this work. So hopefully we'll get into a good back and forth. Thanks.